Nobody told Corporal James Meredith that when the lieutenant fell and the sergeant was carried away bleeding, the correct response was to sit down in the mud of the Hurtgen forest and wait for someone with a higher rank to appear. Nobody explained to him that the battle was, at that point, officially someone else's problem. And because nobody told him any of those things, James Meredith simply did what he had been trained to do. He looked at the 28 exhausted, frightened men around him, took a slow breath, and said, quietly but clearly, "All right. Here is what we are going to do." Half a mile away, watching through field binoculars from a covered position, a German captain named Werner Brandt lowered his lenses and stared for a long moment at nothing in particular. He had seen many things in this war. He had watched entire divisions fold when their commanders were removed from the field. He had seen the logic of leadership play out, again and again, in the most brutal way possible. The head is cut off, and the body stops moving. It was not cruelty. It was simply how armies worked. It was how they had always worked. But these Americans were doing something that did not fit inside that logic. Their officers kept disappearing, to injury, to enemy fire, to the chaos that this particular forest seemed to manufacture endlessly, and still the soldiers kept moving. They kept making decisions. They kept fighting. Brandt could not understand it. He wrote in his field journal that evening, in careful, precise German handwriting, "The enemy continues organized resistance despite repeated loss of visible leadership. Reason unknown." The reason, as it turned out, was not unknown at all. It had simply never occurred to anyone on that side of the war to ask the right question. To understand what Werner Brandt was watching through those binoculars, you have to go back about 2 years, and several thousand miles west, to a flat and baking stretch of land in Georgia called Fort Benning. You have to stand inside the heat and the noise and the organized confusion of an American training camp in 1942, and you have to listen very carefully to what the drill sergeants are actually saying to these young men. Because if you listen, you notice something unusual. They are not just giving orders. They are explaining the reason behind the orders. "You move low because a man who is standing is a man who can be seen," a sergeant named Frank Calloway would tell his squad, again and again. "You use cover because cover keeps you alive, and a man who is alive can still complete the mission. You remember the mission because if I am gone tomorrow, the mission does not go with me. The mission stays. And someone still has to finish it. That someone might be you." Calloway was a large man from Detroit, with hands that had spent years on a factory floor before they learned to carry a rifle. He was not a gentle teacher, but he was a clear one. He did not believe in mystery. He believed in giving a man the full picture, so that when the picture changed, and in war, the picture always changed, the men could adjust without needing permission. He ran a drill that the younger soldiers privately called the disappearing act. In the middle of a training exercise, without warning, Calloway would announce, "I am dead. Figure it out." Then he would step to the side and watch. The first few times he did this with a new squad, the result was predictable. The men looked at each other. Someone asked what they were supposed to do. Someone else suggested they wait. They stood around in an uncertain cluster, which, Calloway would tell them afterward, was the fastest way to become actually dead. But he kept running the drill. Week after week, until the hesitation shortened. Until a private named Donovan, a quiet farm boy from rural Ohio who had never in his life considered himself a leader of any kind, started automatically scanning the terrain and calling out positions to the men beside him. Until the squad stopped waiting to be told and started telling themselves. That, Calloway said, the day Donovan did it for the first time without prompting, is the whole point. The United States Army had not always been built this way. For much of its early history, it followed the same basic theory that nearly every army in the world followed: rank meant authority, authority meant decision-making, and the role of the enlisted soldier was to carry out decisions made above him, not to generate his own. It was a sensible system in some respects. It created order. It created predictability. It also created a dangerous fragility. By the time the Second World War began pulling millions of American men into uniform, the generals responsible for training them had been thinking hard about the fragility. They had studied the First World War. They had studied the way entire assaults stalled and men died waiting for orders that never came because the officer who was supposed to give them had been struck down in the first minutes of an advance. They had asked themselves a simple but uncomfortable question: what happens to an army when you remove its leaders? The answer they arrived at was not to hide the leaders better. The answer was to make sure that losing a leader did not mean losing the ability to lead. The infantry school at Fort Benning, under the direction of generals who believed deeply in this idea, began building it into the foundation of how American soldiers were trained. Every sergeant learned what to do if the lieutenant was gone. Every corporal learned what to do if the sergeant was gone. Every private was taught to understand not just his own assignment but the larger purpose that assignment was serving, so that if everything else fell apart, he could ask himself what the mission needed and move toward that, rather than freezing in place and waiting for a voice that might never come. It sounds simple. In practice, it was a profound shift in how an army thought about its own people. There was another piece to this that went beyond training manuals and doctrine. It had to do with where these men came from. America in 1942 was a country built on a particular kind of stubbornness. It was a country where a man who ran a farm had to make 100 decisions a day, about weather, about soil, about machines that broke in the middle of the planting season, without calling anyone for permission. It was a country where a man who ran a small shop had to solve problems on the spot, with whatever was in front of him, because there was no one else to solve them. It was a country where the distance between a person and their nearest neighbor was sometimes measured in miles, and you learned early that waiting for help was a choice you could not always afford. These were the men who showed up at Fort Benning. Farmers and factory workers and hardware store clerks and carpenters and mechanics. Men who had spent their entire lives figuring things out. The army gave them a structure and a language and a set of skills they had not had before. But the underlying habit, the instinct to assess a situation and act on it, was already there. It had been built into them by the country they came from. German military analysts, trying to understand what they were facing, focused almost entirely on equipment and numbers and tactics. Very few of them thought to ask about the texture of American civilian life and what it produced in a man. It was, in hindsight, a significant oversight. By the autumn of 1944, the war in Western Europe had settled into a grinding, miserable campaign through terrain that seemed designed to make everything as difficult as possible. The Hurtgen Forest, a thick stretch of dark trees along the German-Belgian border, was perhaps the worst of it. The forest swallowed light and sound and direction. It turned every path into a potential trap. It took the advantages that American forces had built up in open country, their mobility, their air support, their ability to coordinate across wide distances, and neutralized most of them. What it could not neutralize was what the men carried inside them. James Meredith had arrived in Europe that summer, 22 years old, one of thousands of replacements fed into units that had been worn down by months of fighting. He was not a remarkable-looking soldier. He was of average height, average build, with the kind of forgettable face that blended easily into a group photograph. Before the war he had worked behind the counter of his family's hardware store in Knoxville, Tennessee, cutting lengths of pipe and helping farmers find the right size of bolt for the right size of problem. He had not thought of himself as someone with leadership ability. He had not thought about it at all, really, until Sergeant Calloway's disappearing act made him realize, to his own surprise, that when no one else was going to say what needed to be said, he was apparently the person who would say it. On a cold morning in November 1944, his platoon moved into the forest toward a crossroads that the battalion needed to control in order to push forward. The lieutenant leading them, a young man named Harris who had been in country for 6 weeks, was gone within the first hour, not gone in the permanent sense, but evacuated, hit in the leg by fire from a position no one had seen in time. The platoon sergeant, a veteran named Cole who had fought in North Africa and carried that experience with a quiet steadiness that everyone around him depended on, was struck by shrapnel from a shell that landed closer than it should have. Cole kept walking for another 20 minutes before a medic noticed he was losing blood steadily enough to become a serious problem and pulled him back. That left Corporal James Meredith standing in the cold and the noise with 28 men looking at him. He told the story years later to a journalist who was writing about the war. "I remember thinking that I needed about 10 more minutes to feel ready," he said. But the situation was not offering me 10 more minutes. So I just started talking. He gathered the 4 squad leaders. He told them what the objective was, the crossroads, the reason they needed it, the route that made the most sense given what they could see. He assigned positions. He told them what to do if they took fire from the left, what to do if they took fire from the right, what to do if he himself went down. He was not brilliant. He was not inspired. He was simply clear, which in that moment and that forest was the most valuable thing he could possibly be. They moved. It took most of the day. There were moments when everything seemed to stop and the forest seemed to press in from all sides, and Meredith felt something very close to panic rising in his chest. During those moments, he told himself what Calloway had told him: know the mission, take care of your men, keep moving toward the objective. It was not a complicated formula. It was, he said later, like a rope he could hold in the dark. By late afternoon, they had the crossroads. They dug in and held it through a cold night, until a company commander arrived at dawn and found them there, tired, hungry, reduced in number, but holding the position. The commander looked at his map, looked at the men, and asked who had been running things. Meredith raised his hand. The commander wrote in his report that day, leadership was distributed throughout the unit at every level. Each man appeared to understand his role in relation to the larger objective. Cohesion was maintained under significant pressure. Recommend recognition of Corporal Meredith. Werner Brandt spent the final months of the war as a prisoner. He was, by all accounts, a cooperative and thoughtful man who answered the questions put to him honestly and with care. The American intelligence officers who debriefed him found him genuinely useful, not because he revealed military secrets of great importance, but because he helped them understand something they had been curious about from the other direction: what it had looked like, from the German side, to fight against American soldiers. He told them about the observation he had made and written in his journal. He told them that it had become, among German officers who discussed it, something between a puzzle and a source of considerable unease. They had tried various explanations. Perhaps the Americans were hiding their officers, placing them farther back from the front, making them harder to identify and eliminate. Perhaps there was some communication system they had not detected. Perhaps it was simply confusion: the Americans appeared organized but were actually running on chaos that happened to point in the right direction. None of those explanations satisfied Brandt himself. He had watched too carefully for too long. What he had seen was not the appearance of organization. It was the real thing. The Americans were genuinely capable of functioning without visible leadership because something had been built into each individual soldier that removed the need for constant direction. He had no framework to explain it. He simply knew he had seen it, and that it had contributed, in ways he could not fully quantify, to the outcome of the war. The American officer sitting across from him nodded slowly when Brandt finished. Then he explained, in simple terms, what Corporal Meredith and Private Donovan and Sergeant Calloway and the infantry school at Fort Benning had known for years. He explained the disappearing drill. He explained the philosophy of making every man a potential leader. He explained that the American army had looked at the fragility of top-down command and decided, deliberately, to build something stronger. Brandt was quiet for a long moment after the officer finished. "We had a doctrine for that," he said finally. "Mission tactics. The idea that soldiers should understand the purpose behind their orders, so that they could adapt when circumstances changed." He paused. "We wrote it down. We taught it in our officer schools. But we taught it to officers." Another pause. "You taught it to everyone." The officer across the table did not say anything. He let the silence do its work. James Meredith came home to Knoxville in the spring of 1945. He reopened the hardware store that had been managed by his mother while he was gone, and he went back to cutting pipe and finding bolts and helping farmers with their problems. He was not celebrated in the way that some men were. His name did not appear in newspapers. He was simply a young man who had come back from a very difficult thing and resumed his life with the practical steadiness of someone who had learned not to waste energy on drama. He married a woman named Ruth in 1947. They had 3 children. He ran the hardware store for 40 years. Decades later, when the journalist found him and asked him to describe what it had felt like to take command in the forest that morning, to be the one who stepped forward when there was no one else left to step forward, he thought about it for a while before answering. "I do not think I was brave," he said. "I think I was just prepared. Somebody spent a lot of time making sure I knew what to do. So when the moment came, I already knew." He looked out the window of his store at the Tennessee street outside. "That is the real story, I think. Not me. The people who made sure I was ready." He was right, of course. He usually was. The German soldiers who watched American units hold together when their leaders fell were seeing the product of a decision made years earlier and thousands of miles away, a decision to trust ordinary men with extraordinary responsibility. To believe that a farm boy from Ohio or a hardware store clerk from Tennessee, given the right preparation and the right understanding of what the mission required, could rise to any occasion the occasion demanded. It turned out that belief was not optimistic. It was accurate. And that accuracy, that stubborn, carefully built, deliberately taught capacity in every single soldier to look at a hard situation and say, all right, here is what we are going to do, changed the course of events in ways that no amount of equipment or strategy alone could have managed. The reason behind it was not a secret. It was never a secret. It was simply a choice that some people made, long before the fighting began, about what kind of soldiers they wanted to send into the world. They wanted soldiers who would keep going. So they did.